Hello, this is Debbie Peterson, and this is Corruption Chronicles, the stories of people who've experienced corruption in local politics and the ways that they are combating it and making a change. Today, we have with us Michael Goldstein, and Michael is the author of Return of the Light, a political fable in which the American people retake their country, and Blessed Disillusionment, letting go of what cannot save us, turning to what can. I wanted to give you a quote that comes with all of this. It's from Cornel West. And he said, Michael Goldstein is a genuine love warrior and justice seeker. His heart, mind, soul, and voice empower us all in these turbulent times. And Michael worked until recently as an appellate lawyer. He was handling death penalty and other indigent cases. He's a graduate of Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and Stanford Law School. He most recently worked in the movement against police violence. He spent nearly 3 weeks with water protectors at Standing Rock, and he ran for Nancy Pelosi's House seat under the slogan, "New faces in Congress cannot stop the rise of fascism or bring us a caring society." Michael would have used the office to build the movement that can. So I had a question, Michael. I told you I was going to start with one here. And I'll start by saying I'll give you a little minute to think about it. But I wanted to ask you, so think about this one while I do the rest of my intro. But I wanted to ask you, for me, there's kind of a cringe factor in the terminology of fascism and revolution. They seem to be things that are almost they're grab words, and they always make me think, oh, that's too strong. I can't go that far. But then when I looked back at my book that I read, your book, I should say, that I was reading, it's full of comments. It's comments agreeing with you said, amens, folded back pages, underlines, and I was really inspired by it. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about the terminology, and maybe you can enlighten us. But I'll let you think about that for a second, because I also wanted to let folks know that this podcast, Corruption Chronicles, arose out of the book that I wrote called The Happiest Corruption, Sleaze, Lies, and Suicide in a California Beach Town. And that's the true life story, the true crime story of the corruption I found when I became the mayor of my town. And I found that a whole lot of other people have had similar experiences. And so I started this podcast so we could cover some of those. You can find the book, The Happiest Corruption, just by Googling The Happiest Corruption, either online anywhere, or you can go to Amazon.com and search for Happiest Corruption, and you'll be able to find it there. You can also find it on my website, debbiepeterson.com, and you can find an online course called Double Dias, Adventures in Local Government, and that will give you an opportunity to streamline what took me 6 years to learn. You can do it in 6 hours and become effective at working with local government to do things to improve your communities. So I've given Michael a chance to get a sip of coffee or water or something. And I wonder, Michael, I'll ask you the easy question next, but I wondered if you could comment at all on me and my cringe factor. I'll take responsibility for that.
Well, thank you for the question. You did sort of pull a fast one on me, because my plan, you notice I haven't said anything about revolution yet.
No.
My plan was to talk about the need for building a massive popular movement I actually wrote it down better than I can. Well, yeah, it was to point out that so many of us feel, at least on the state and national level, and I really admire what you're doing and teaching people to do on the local level. In terms of the big state and national issues, so many of us feel powerless in the face of a system that, in my view, is really run by corporate wealth. And so when I first refer to revolution when I'm talking to people, first I say, I'm a little afraid to bring up the R word because it is cringeworthy. Even in my own mind, after all these years, there is an association with chaos, violence, and things falling apart. I begin the book with a quotation from a political science professor I had in 1968, defining revolution as a permanent change in the structure of politics, which results in new ways of mobilizing and sharing power. A permanent change in the structure of politics, which results in new ways of mobilizing and sharing power. And what the book calls for, and after easing people in better than you let me do, eventually defines as revolution, is building a massive, sustained, strategic grassroots movement that will eventually create new structures and institutions that, as the existing order unravels, which I believe it's doing, we can replace it with our own democratic forms, truly democratic forms where we've learned to listen to and work with each other, starting on local levels, to run our own society in the interests of peace and justice and sustainability and a caring society. Shall I
Thank you.
answer? Yeah.
Yeah, you did. And I'm sorry to throw that one at you there. What happened is I went back to your book and I found all these underlines and things and I remembered that and as you're speaking, I am remembering that as I read the book, I realized that your definition was not something that makes me cringe at all. It's something I can completely buy into. I do have a couple of questions on that if you'll bear with me.
I I can, or did you want me to touch on the point about fascism too, or?
Yes, yeah, please cover that and then I'll come back to it. Yes, thank
Okay,
you.
okay. So I don't throw the word around lightly, meaning I'm not going to assume that the guy in the apartment next to me who votes for Donald Trump is a fascist, or that anybody else who believed or believes that what he represents is the way forward is fascist. Um, you might remember that in the book there are a couple of chapters that try to rigorously define what fascism has been historically and the conditions that lead to its rise. And one of the factors that defines it is a merger between large-scale corporations and government. And I would argue that we don't have it in the form that Mussolini developed it in Italy, where it was, everybody could see it was the corporatist state that was the idea. But that the influence of corporate wealth, what some politicians call the billionaire class, others of us call the 0.1%, on our politics is dominant. And again, I'm thinking more on the national and state levels, because I realize there's more room for what you are doing on local levels. So we have that already. Other factors that tend to give rise to fascist politics are diverting people's attention from what their economy and their government are doing to them and where they're taking their money and where it goes and how they're not being taken care of or allowed to take care of themselves with their tax money. Diverting our attention from that by focusing on the demeaned other, whether it's another race, another religion, another ethnicity. There are strong strains of that in our politics today, and there have been for a long time. Another is militarism. And I just reread part of the book where there's a footnoted statement that we currently have military operations in 27 different countries. And we have, I believe, 180 We have bases in 180 countries, 800 bases around the world. May not feel like it at home, but we're a militarized society. What we don't have is much of is armed gangs of thugs in the street to stamp out opposition, or um, or government repression of opposition right now. But this is turning into one of my long answers. But
That's
it,
okay. I'm
yeah,
all ears, and
yeah,
I don't
okay,
think
yeah,
anybody's lost you yet.
okay. The the conditions that give rise to complete authoritarianism or fascism along the lines of the model that I was mentioning are enough of a crisis so that people are mobilized in a society and demand fundamental change. And one way that can go is towards a popular revolution, whether violent or nonviolent, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I will say, in case we don't get to it, I think violent doesn't work and nonviolence does, and that's been shown. So that's one way it can go. If the old order is collapsing, and the people are ready in various ways to take over, then there can be positive revolutionary change. Another way is that a, a wealthy elite class that exercises outsized influence on the politics, the government, the media, the education system of a society, if they are losing hold because of economic crises or climate crises, which seem to be coming our way, or more blowback from all the countries that we're bombing, that if things get really bad here so that people are demanding change, then the center and liberal and conservative solutions favored by some segments of that wealthy class aren't working anymore. And the folks, I named a couple in the book, the Kochs, the Adelsons, there are some others, there are actually a bunch of others, who fund proto-fascist or neo-fascist movements. They gain the ascendancy because nothing else is working. And in the book, I say a lot more than I have here about how I'm pretty sure that is the United States' historical post-war position of economic hegemony throughout the world declines, and climate change produces more disasters and other issues facing us, that we're going to reach one of those critical revolutionary situations, and that we do have a real danger of fascism arising, particularly since, and again, it's hard for me to be this kind of an author and then talk, because I've got so many long lists of evidence for the rise of fascism in the book that I can't give you and our audience right
Well,
now.
and that's why you write a book, and that's why I wrote a book, because I had way too much to say that I could ever say in one little podcast. So, yes. Did you want to say more on that though?
Well, let me just ask you if, I mean, so there is a, I was going to ask you if that at all softened the cringe factor. At least when I said I'm not throwing the word around lightly and calling everybody I disagree with a fascist. But there's an unavoidable cringe factor to, looking reality in the face as to what I believe we are facing. If we look at all the social and economic and political and historical dynamics, it's friggin' scary.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why feeling as unworthy as I do, I had to write this book, is because I think there's only one way out, and I don't hear other people talking about it. So there you have it.
Well, thank you. And yes, it does hugely soften the cringe factor, and that's why I asked you first. Um, and I'm kind of glad that I didn't give you fair warning, because I think people are now hearing it straight from you without, without a pre-rehearsed um, response, and that makes it, I think, more legitimate. And I want people to understand that I believe that what you're saying is legitimate. So I'm grateful to you for saying that up front, because I don't want it to get in the way of the message. I want people to understand what it means up front. And if we can get past the cringe, then we can look at the rest of it. But if we can get past that emotional response, then we can apply our executive brains to really thinking about what it is you're saying, and how that might apply in our situations. So I did want to go back to a couple of things you said. I I have called it, and the term revolution I think may be appropriate, and I have called it, though maybe I'm more of a chicken than you are, but I've called it evolution. And because I think that we all hold this belief that we're evolving for the better. I'm not sure that's true. I think it may be an urban myth. When I look back to where we were 50 years ago, I'm not so sure that I feel that we're that much better. When I look back to the way my grandparents made change take place 100 years ago, it wasn't that different from where we are now. And so that kind of worries me, but I would still like to think that we can have evolutionary change, and that we can evolve within the ways we operate and understand. And in some ways, it's a look back. It's a look back to the way our government was intended to function. Maybe it's not even evolutionary. Maybe it's maybe it's historical. But I'm kind of talking in riddles here. Going back to all of that, though, you talk a lot about democracy, and I know one of the big conversations that I hear is that, well, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. We elect people who vote for president. We do have a democratic vote in some cases. We actually vote directly at the local and state level, but certainly not at the presidential level. Um, so are you suggesting that we should move into being a democracy rather than a republic?
Great question. And I'm actually not the best person to answer it, even though you're asking what I'm suggesting. So it's a fair question. There's a whole literature on direct democracy, forms of decision making that I think are in between direct democracy and the kind of representative system that we have right now, where we elect people whom we don't know, who are sold to us like a box of cereal. They get consultants to decide how to brand themselves and raise as much money as they can for commercials and mailings to advertise themselves. So my guess is that even in representative systems, there are more democratic, if you will, ways of, and in the bio you mentioned that my 2018 quixotic race against Nancy Pelosi. There were, without going into details, I did that to put out a message.
Yeah.
But there was one point where I realized that the dynamics were such that it was possible that in California's top two primary system, I could actually make it into the general election. And it was
Wow.
It was also vaguely possible, in my imagination at least, that if that happened, enough people were tired of the old politics that Nancy Pelosi represented, where she goes out and raises, I just read it in the book, I think her daily average 365 days a year is $268,000 in fundraising. And her county is the city and county of San Francisco, which is very liberal and progressive. So I thought, holy mackerel.
You can say whatever you like on this one. It's private, but I still operate under the First Amendment. I'm not going to censor anything you say.
All right, thank you. yeah, I probably did think, holy shit, what if I got sent to Washington? And I realized that I would have, in the time between the election and getting sworn in January, I would have to find a bunch of people who were willing to meet with me maybe every other week that, and I'm not talking about the set up town hall meetings that every person in Congress does, to sell what they're doing and to take questions and to help people navigate the bureaucracy. I'm talking about a group of people who would show up meeting after meeting, hopefully a very diverse group of people, to whom my commitment would be, I'm going to tell you everything that's being put in front of me to decide. I'm going to tell you everything that's being said to me by whom about what to do. I'm going to tell you the pressures that I'm feeling to go along, to get along, or to listen to this side or that side, or to compromise here so that I can get what I want for the district there. And you all are going to have to keep me honest, because you're plugging me into a system where the best people, hardly any, I'm apparently talking to one who did it at the local level, but where hardly any people who enter that system manage to not get, to some extent at least, confused, co-opted, and corrupted.
Well, that's
So,
interesting. Sorry, interrupted you
yeah,
there. Go ahead.
no, that's all right. All I was trying to do was remember the original question, which I just
Oh,
did, and get back to it. But if you have a follow-up,
well,
go
I
ahead.
don't remember the original question, but
Democracy
um,
versus a republic.
oh yeah, there you go. Um, I think it's interesting because what you're describing in some ways is what we might call a kitchen cabinet, or we might call your ledge aide, who's the person, your legislative aide, who's the person who's supposed to do all the research and help you figure it out. Or I suppose that's at a local level. If you get past city hall, if you get to be a county supervisor, you get to have someone who's paid to help you.
And if
Um,
you get to Congress, you have to hire people who've been doing that, who know their way around, know what
right.
they've been doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And I and it that is absolutely how I did it. I had people who were friends who were willing to hold me accountable, who I could have the conversations about ethics with. And I early on I started realizing that I was becoming I don't know how to say it. I was becoming part of the system.
Mm.
And it was a and I'm very alert to company culture because I have a degree in communication, and because I did a lot of work with small companies, smaller organizations about the size of local government on how their companies worked. I did management consulting for them, and I was always very sensitive to company culture. And so I realized that almost immediately after I was elected, and other people have spoken about this, almost immediately after I was elected, all of a sudden, I knew, and I did know a lot more than most people do about what's going on. I also understood a lot more about why it goes on that way, legitimately why it goes on that way, for good reasons why it goes on that way. But that created a kind of arrogance and a kind of impatience where which I see at City Hall constantly, and I see in local government everywhere, almost everywhere, which was the public are a pain. They get in the way. We can't get things done, even when, well, even when we're trying to get legitimate things done, they're in the way. Don't rock the boat. Don't create any controversy. Whatever you do, don't ask the public because that rocks the boat and creates controversy and it creates work and we don't get things done as well and it's not efficient and that's from the end of just trying to get a job done. Then there's the other side of it, which is, it's really uncomfortable to have to be on camera and express how you feel and maybe ask a question that sounds stupid or is in fact stupid. And it's there forever. You can't get away from it. And so sometimes it's just easier to have the hard conversations where maybe you're not ready to come down with an opinion on something and state where you stand. Um, it's easier just to do those in closed session or behind closed doors, which is absolutely opposite of what we're meant to do. And so I found myself becoming a part of that. I was becoming a part of City Hall rather than becoming the person who was supposed to be representing the people who voted me into that position, who trusted me to look after their interests. And so as soon as I realized that, I have the capacity when I realize something like that, when something like that hits me, I have the capacity to step back and look at it and say, wow, what's going on here? And then talk with other people about it. And I had that group of people that you're discussing that knew what was going on, knew me, and were highly ethical.
Nice.
And we challenged each other.
Yeah.
So, and I think that is what's required. And if you can't elect people who have those kind of people around them, then they're probably not someone you should elect. I think like there's a Chinese proverb, tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are. And
Mm.
so we want to, probably a good idea to look at whose people's friends are and who people's friends are not. Sometimes I say, I'm proud of my enemies. So we talked about evolution and we talked about a republic versus a democracy, and I appreciate that the input that there's maybe a middle ground there, which is helpful, and I'll personally look at that more.
And let me just say one or two other sentences about that, because I had largely ducked that question. And one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to be humble and say, I've got some answers here, and particularly a vision of how we need to move forward in general. But the development of a program, meaning what we want in terms of policy for our country, strategy and tactics for an organization that's working for revolutionary change, um, and structure, both organizationally as we work together and what we're trying to build for the future. The ideas for that should emerge from the conversation among the people who are doing it. And if it starts soon enough, I'll be one of them. But but there's some things like forms of more participatory decision making that I just haven't looked into. Um, I am imagining that we will gravitate towards not just reforming what we've got, meaning money out of politics, requiring kitchen cabinets if there's a way to do that, but how would you police who's in it? Yeah, um, my guess is we'll be wanting to look for more participatory forms, but there are a lot of things that can't be mapped out from the perspective of the year 2022 that will emerge as we start building what we have to build.
Yeah, that makes me. I have another question for you that I didn't warn you about, but I have friends who tell me that the younger generation, I think we've been hearing this for millennia. My mother used to tell me, oh, Socrates said the same thing. I don't know if it was Socrates, but somebody back in the ancient Greek said the same stuff. But the younger generation is a mess and they're not very good and they don't get anything done and they don't pay any attention and they don't participate and they're lazy and blah, 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 blah. And yet that is not my experience. My experience is that I'm absolutely inspired by kids who are coming forward these days. I'm thrilled by what I'm seeing, by what I'm hearing, by their how conscientious they are, how they are engaged, how they're disillusioned, and I understand that. And my thought would be what I want more than anything is to encourage their involvement in all of those things that you're talking about. And I'm wondering if you have any feedback or thoughts on that.
I'm a little more prepared than you thought because you did, when we talked ahead of this podcast, suggest that I think about ways that I can offer
Mhm.
our viewers to become involved. And and we can get to that at the appropriate time. But one of the most humble one was, for God's sake, if you know any young activists, would you email me and, with their permission, put me in touch with them, because I need help. I am not plugged into that community. And so that implies the answer to the question you asked, I think, which is I share your view of them. I mean, I watched what people were doing around here. I live in Oakland, California, and high school students and college fresh anyway, people in their first year of college, organized and led a 15,000 person rally and march in the wake of George Floyd's shooting. And I am aware that young activists are doing a lot to protest and try to block school closures and privatization, which is happening in this city apace. And like everybody, almost everybody, I suppose, I watch what Greta Thunberg has been able to galvanize around the climate, and what young people in Extinction Rebellion are doing. So yes, absolutely. Are there people in the generations behind us who are lost or apathetic? Or usually when people talk about apathy and the 50% who don't vote and all that, I tend to reframe it as helplessness. But in any event, I'm not going to generalize about any generation, but yeah, absolutely. There's a whole lot of hope there. And I would like to give them, as somebody who became an activist 54, 55 years ago, I'd like to pass on some of the things I've learned about what does and doesn't work, including disillusioning them about all the stuff that we were taught about how if we just work a little harder at making the way things are set up right now serve the people better, that'll work.
Okay, so then we come back to the question that I was supposed to ask you first.
I was trying to do that.
Nice job. You got me there. So the title of your book is Blessed Disillusionment, Letting Go of What Cannot Save Us and Turning to What Can. So do you see your message as being a negative message or a positive message?
So I could be a wise guy and just say yes, or divulge a little bit more and say both, which is true. And I'd like to elaborate on that. I see myself like somebody coming into a village where people are trying to cure a tuberculosis outbreak with saltwater baths, mustard plasters, and leeches, and saying, folks, I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is what you're doing won't work. It doesn't help, except maybe for the placebo effect. The good news is there's this drug called penicillin that will rid the body of this disease. And we have it here. And I want to tell you about it. So the disillusioning part, the part that can be pretty depressing to write and to read, is the first half of the book, about where I go through trying to get more people to vote, trying to get money out of politics, trying to get new and better people running for office in whatever political party you think has the answers, hoping that they won't get confused, co-opted, and corrupted as they work their way into what has to be done to succeed in the system. Petitioning, protesting endlessly, sending money and clicking on petition buttons on cause after cause after cause. The first part of the book is an attempt at, and I think a successful demonstration of the fact that those, while sometimes important and critical and useful, often useful, um, as strategies for getting us out of the messes that we're in and the deeper stuff we're headed into, are just woefully inadequate. So that's the disillusioning part, and the part that can be hard to swallow, and if we stop there would lead to despair. But the second half of the book is about why it's not Pollyannish to talk about constructing something entirely new is the old is decaying and running into crisis, and that setting out the skeleton of a roadmap about what that could look like, how we could do that, what the prerequisites for building the kind of movement it would take are, and how that small fraction of us who agree today, or at least on reading the book, this is how we need to go, can begin to get that ball rolling, and what could create a snowball effect, and how to organize ourselves as we do that. So yeah, so it's depending on where you start and where you stop, it's a message of despair and of hope. And I think that I called it blessed disillusionment, basically because something up there told me to, but I liked it because um, I think that letting go of the illusions and
Mm-hmm.
seeing and clearing away, well, the metaphor I use in the book is an invisibility cloak, but clearing away the illusions that obscure what actually is a realistic path forward, that is a blessed find.
Yeah. So I'm still unclear on what that path is. I'm going to give you feedback though on what I've been saying, and I think some of what I've been saying has been influenced by your writing and by conversations with lots of people over the last few months and years. Um, so what I'm saying to people nowadays is it's not enough to campaign for your favorite candidate. It's not enough even to vote. Those are all good things. It's not enough to march. Marching can be a good thing too. However, if you really want anything to change, you have to show up. You have to be at those meetings. And at a local level, we can do that. You can go down to City Hall. You can get the agenda online. You can show up at the meetings. You can write herd on what the people you elect are doing. You can tell them if they're honest and genuine. You can tell them what it's like on your street, what it looks like from where you stand. Because if you don't tell them, they don't know, and they can't govern in your on your behalf or the behalf of your neighbors if they have no idea what it's like to be you, and you have to tell them that. So it's about showing up, and it's about showing up, everyday people showing up and using the gifts that they have, their individual gifts and abilities, to write herd on their government. Because if we don't like the government, then it's up to us to make a difference, because the government doesn't belong to the government, it belongs to us. It is we the people, and it is a government of us, by us, and for us. We have to own that. And in terms of what you're saying, I think there is one thing that holds true through the generations. And if some of the old ways don't work that we've mentioned, the one thing that does hold true is the power in numbers. It's the power in numbers that really has the influence. And so how that shows up is another thing. But what I'd really like to understand then is some practical things. Can you give us some practical suggestions? So what you're talking about is change, but what does that look like, and how do we manifest that as individuals, as people, as a community?
So I like the message that you're giving to people about working on the local level. There's a part of my brain that's saying, I'll bet that works better in a smaller town like yours
Mm-hmm.
and in a city like mine, where development money and certain other forms of wealth, but particularly that one, are able to do the same kind of packaging of politicians um, that we see, at higher levels of government.
I'm going to interrupt you there and
Yeah.
tell you that the corruption where I am is so strong that it feels like the very same thing that you're talking about. It's the same thing about vast amounts of development money, vast amounts of cannabis money,
Mm,
vast amounts of black market cannabis.
mm.
Um, and the money is so big, there's nothing you could ever do to stand against it.
Yeah, and
So
I'm
it's
sorry, go
big
ahead.
here too, even on a small level. I
Uh,
understand you can get your hands around. You can. It's easier to get your hands around smaller government,
mhm.
but the way that corruption affects it, I don't think it's very different.
Okay,
Anyway,
that's an eye opener for me. I am remembering that a guy named Bruce A. Dixon, who died a couple of years ago, was one of the journalists in an organization called the Black Agenda Report. Talks about, and I've quoted him at length in the book about how he worked in local politics in Chicago for 20 years, organizing, mobilizing people, um, and they finally got their people into office. That a majority of the city council, and I think the mayor too. Um, and he said, the phrase "holding people's feet to the fire once they're in office" was on everybody's lips, but we never figured out how to do that. And you know, I'm sh- I don't doubt that showing up in the ways that you're encouraging people to do helps. Um, and because of, and it's got its limits, just as you were saying, vote, get others to vote, work for your candidates, but it's not enough. I, I,
I'm going to interrupt you again. I can tell people how to do it, and I can show people how to do it because I've done it and I
uh-huh,
know what works.
yeah,
And that's one of the reasons I did the course, because it took me. I started out on a planning commission that went the way it's supposed to go. It was great,
uh-huh,
and the last 2 years I was the chair, and it was great before I was the chair. It wasn't because I was the chair, and then I ran for city council, and that's when I started to see some things that worried me. And then when I became mayor, I confronted them. And that was 10 years. It was a 10-year learning curve. And then I
mm,
ran for county supervisor and I learned more. I put more of the pieces together of that jigsaw, connected more of those dots. And um, I learned a lot along the way, partly because I have a degree in communication and public relations. And I know I'm good at working with people, I'm good at working with the press and media, and I have an analytical mind. And so that was all very helpful. But I also had a lot of people telling me what was going on.
mm,
And so there are ways to hold their feet to the fire. And I am going to give a plug to both my book, The Happiest Corruption, and also to the 6 hour course, because you can learn in 6 hours what it took me 6 years to learn.
mm,
And there are ways to hold them accountable that do work and did work in our case. The corruption, it's hard to fight fair against people who aren't fighting fair. It's very difficult because you're always a few steps behind them, but there are ways to get a few steps in front of them. And I can show people what those ways are and help them understand that. So it is possible.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and again, you've opened my eyes some. I want to circle back to the question you actually asked me, though, which was, not about the local level, but what is it that I'm talking about, transformation of
Mhm.
politics on a
Right,
national
right.
scale. And while what you are educating people to do and how to do is not simple, um, what I'm talking about is more complex and takes a lot longer.
Mhm.
Um, And I mean, for the kind of massive changes that I'm talking about are going to have to be forced, compelled. The military industrial complex, which, every year both parties in Congress shove more into their unaudited budget than than the administration asks for, and every year the administration asks for more. These folks who, most of that is just corporate welfare, but some of it's going to intervene in tiny little countries here or there where the national security establishment thinks that there's some sort of threat to our strategic and corporate economic interests. They're not going to give up that power and control just because we are mobilizing to vote more or showing up in greater numbers at their town hall meetings and telling them, what it's like to sleep in a tent with your kids.
That's right.
So I'm talking about, and for some reason, I find this hard to say too, because I'm imagining it's not what people want to hear. I'm talking about a fairly long-term process, not decades, because we don't have decades, but definitely a number of years, in order to compel the kinds of structural change that we need. We need a movement that really dwarfs the anti-war and civil rights movements of the 60s and 70s, the kind that, when it's organized enough, people, whether it's going on general strikes or tax strikes or consumer boycotts, we can exercise enough power so that when those in charge of the levers of power at the government level move those levers, they can move them, but nothing's going to happen because we do the work, we pay the taxes. Other than the government, we buy the goods.
Mm-hmm.
So to
Well, no,
create
we
that,
also buy the government goods. It is our money. It
exactly,
belongs to us.
exactly,
It's not theirs to mess with and throw in private funds. It's our money.
exactly, and there are ways to withhold that too when there's a large enough mass of people and enough unity, so that we're ready to do that. But for that to happen, there are three prerequisites. One is a level of consciousness in the population as a whole, so that a critical mass of us understand that the old ways don't work and a new way can. The second is various forms of organization among those of us who understand that, so that people learn how to work together, learn how to solve problems together, learn how to listen to each other, learn how to do projects together, and learn their power when they do show up en masse and say, you know what, we're not paying our property taxes this year, or whatever, or a boycott, and realize the power that they have, that we have when we act together. So I've mentioned two things so far: consciousness and organization. The third is the creation of new structures that we run ourselves. I largely at the local level, neighborhood after conflict resolution programs, neighborhood gardens, neighborhood after school programs, neighborhood and community programs to help youth who are going astray. And there's a longer list than I can come up with or that you want to hear right now. But in the process of creating new structures at that level and organizing ourselves to go into the various campaigns and struggles around, you know, diesel pollution in the neighborhoods near the West Oakland port, or closing schools where you are, or development interests taking over, that as we being organized enough so that we can train ourselves, that as we go into whatever those campaigns draw us, we can spread the word about the what we understand about the larger situation and what needs to happen and how to do it. So in order to create those three prerequisites, well, the building new structures is happening anyway. People are doing a whole lot of that under the radar. And various kinds of consciousness raising are happening too. And people are organizing to do the protest actions or the electoral campaigns or whatever. It's but to create those prerequisites to an extent so that in time of crisis we can really mobilize a revolutionary movement. Can I use the R word now?
Yeah. Yeah, as long as people tune in at the beginning or re-listen if they tuned in the middle.
Exactly. I mean, the reason I crack jokes about it is it's still, I'm a little nervous about using it. Anyway, I'm sorry. Um, to create that kind of movement, it's going to take years, and it's going to take thinking about how to do it. And it's going to take the relative handful of us who resonate with this message now getting together, brainstorming, organizing ourselves to begin to spread this word. And it, I could say more. I don't know right now whether I handled your original
Yeah.
question about how do
Let,
we do this or not.
let me jump in with a couple of questions. And I think,
Sure.
yes, you've said a lot. And I think we've probably come almost to the end of the list of things that we'd said we wanted to talk about. Um, the concept of it taking years, it absolutely does. And one of the reasons people lose heart is because they see an issue, they go in, they jump up and down, they holler, and it doesn't happen right away. And
Right.
part of the reason it doesn't happen right away for a lot of reasons. If we're looking at the constructive side of it, it doesn't happen right away because we are in effect a democracy. We do have to give everybody an opportunity to be heard. That does take time. There are methods of doing it. There are prescribed methods of doing it in public meetings that are actually pretty effective and that can be used constructively. And I remember learning in communication school that a committee of any more than 12 is impossible.
Mm,
Well, how many millions of people do we have in our country? I mean, in my little town alone, it's 13,000. And when you are trying to engage 13,000 people in making decisions that affect the community, that is a very long process. And so it takes time and it's incredibly frustrating. So I think one of the things is to help people understand that it is a marathon, it's not a sprint.
right.
And you and I know that. And I'll say from studying how people took down corruption in their communities, it didn't happen right away. In Kansas City, they had a 50-year corrupt political machine that operated and it took more than 10 years to bring it down. And that was with every group in the community, every ethnic group, every religious group, every political group, every gender, they all had to work together. And when they did work together, and when they had the help of President Roosevelt and his treasury and the FBI, they took it down.
Mm,
And it stayed down. And they found better ways to run cities. And so, but that took 10 years. And it does take time.
yeah.
And so that's one message that I think is really important for people to understand. It's there's no immediate fix, and you're going to win some, lose some battles before you win the war, and you have to stay with it. The other thing, I still will argue it. I think you'll actually agree that it happens at the local level. It happens among small groups of us. That's always the most effective way to communicate. And for me, I see that one of the things that happens, not always, but often, people who start in local office they'll move up the line. They'll go from planning commissioner to mayor or to council member to supervisor to state representative to federal representative. And if we are choosing people of with good ethics at the local level, and we're sending those people up the line, we're in better shape. And if we are choosing it also, the people who are at the local level actually have the ear of the people at higher levels. They do meet with the mayors, they do regularly meet with, they do encounter one another. And so your local representatives have the opportunity to send your message up the line and send it up very powerfully. And so if we're choosing the right local representatives and they're moving up the line and they're passing our message up the line, I still argue that it can be constructive. But regardless what that structure is, it still starts locally, and it starts with choosing people of integrity at the local level. And that's something that's my biggest battle is people. I don't know why, but they seem to say, they have this ridiculous saying, politics as usual. And I don't know why I would put someone in charge of my money who's corrupt, but at the long and the short of it is we're paying in a lot of money and we're putting crooks in charge of it. Now, why would you do that? It doesn't make any sense to me. And if anyway, so I'll get off my soapbox there, but I do think a lot of it starts at the local level, and it starts with our understanding of who we want representing us and how we choose people of good repute. And as you say, retain people of good repute.
So, it does sound like we have a fundamental disagreement. I mean, when at the level of generality of this statement, it starts at the local level. I totally agree. The kind of organizing and educating that I think has to be done ain't going to happen over the internet. It's, what people who wanted unions in their workplaces, were doing it at the beginning of the last century through the 60s and are starting to do now is, visiting with their neighbors, coworkers, fellow congregants, and having conversations about what's going on, what people feel they need, what they see as the problem, and what they think about the solution that we're offering.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of a sufficient path forward to save us from climate disaster, that thing that we politely call economic inequality, which I don't even know what the correctly crass term for it would be. I mean, gross exploitation to the point of grinding people into poverty and death.
Stealing their homes, I called it in real estate.
Okay, thank you. Polluting the environment and making I just, reread the statistics that our police kill people at a rate, and I have nothing against police officers as individuals. They're in my family and trying to do the right thing. But our system of policing kills 3 times as many people per capita as our nearest competitor, and that's Canada. And both are, way ahead of the rest of the world. So, a system of policing that kills, brutalizes, and if you're in the wrong community, terrorizes people into submission so they don't rise up in some kind of revolutionary fashion. I don't think these things are going to go away by doing the absolute best that we can. And yes, do it. Trying to find the best people to run for office at a local level, trying to keep in touch with them in ways so that their ethics stay intact, and trying to have them be the ones who somehow get enough backing to rise to higher levels. But I didn't get on my soapbox as much as I do sometimes about this, but the extent to which the small class of people who effectively rule our country have brutalized and killed millions of people abroad to protect their interests. And the few times they felt like they needed to do it here, whether it was the Obama administration's coordinated raids on the Occupy encampments, which were only a threat on the consciousness level. They introduced the concept of the 1%, or the way the FBI disrupted and murdered people in the Black Power movement, or the killings and frame-ups that happened in the early years of the labor movement. When these folks get pushed to the wall, which the crises that a lot of us are predicting are ahead of us will cause, and to some segments of that class, they're there already. They're not going to give up their power and their way of doing things, no matter who we try to elect into the formal positions of power. And
however, yes, that is, I'm not saying that's a solution alone.
okay.
However, I'm not saying that's the only way to do it.
Gotcha. All right. I'm saying
it's part of it. It's part of a solution.
And I'm not saying don't do it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, good.
However, if you have those people, in positions of power, at least those people are going to work with you.
Yeah.
Rather than if you don't.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, good. I have a feeling that if anybody is still watching this far into our conversation, that they won't be a whole lot longer. And I would like to answer the question you prepared me to answer earlier about what do people do if they at least somewhat resonate with what I'm saying. What's an immediate step they can take? Is that all right?
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. All right. So I said one thing already, but I'm not going to start there again. Buy the book and read it.
And what's the book called again?
The recent one, the nonfiction one, is Blessed Disillusionment, Letting Go of What Cannot Save Us, Turning to What Can. And, I've given you a graphic that you might flash later about reminding people of the title and where they might get it. What I forgot to put on there is I can say buy the book uncorrupted by profit motives, because all the proceeds from it are going back into a separate account dedicated to spreading this message. So buy the book and read it. It's relatively short. The last, I don't know how many pages are endnotes and appendices, so it's only 149 pages before all that. And the older book, Return of the Light, makes the same case. The subtitles of Political Fable in which the American people retake their country, and makes the same case in a work of fiction where no, I don't want to.
So
I don't need to do a big pitch for the book, but
you can find these books where? On Amazon, right?
You can find them on Amazon. The Blessed Disillusionment, your local bookstore can also order it through their normal distributor. Or I just discovered something online called bookshop.org, if you don't like working with Amazon, where if you order through them, they will have Blessed Disillusionment and most other books. And you can designate who your local bookstore is that you want a cut of the price to go to. So I just want to say Return of the Light is a fictionalized version that, if all this sounds Pollyannish and like it can't really happen, the positive part, it presents a scenario looking back from a century from now about how we saved our world. And so it can be inspiring in that way. So buy the book, read it. If you are so inclined, do what it suggests at the very end, which is set up a study discussion group or study action group among people who are interested in the question of, what's the real way forward? Is there are there ways out of the mess we're in rather than continuing to try this same old stuff and hoping that it works this decade, even though it didn't work the last few. And the idea in the book is that those groups will be self-propagating, that people who resonate with one or another strategy for moving forward in a new way will go out and start their own study action groups to recruit more people to that vision. And that's that part of the consciousness raising. Now, this is already, I realize, asking for a greater level of commitment than some people may find works for them. If that's the case, buy the book and give it to your young friends, either activist or disillusioned and scared. What else? I actually made a couple of notes on this one.
What I loved was your suggestion that if you know a young activist, have them contact you. And I think that's huge. I think that that connection between the senior and junior activists is extremely important. I would really strongly encourage people to do that.
Me too. And that gets to one of the other things on my list that's sort of in that same category. I need help. Debbie, with your time in politics, maybe this wasn't an issue for you, but for a lot of us who are writers, there's a difference between being a writer and an author. An author being someone who gets on podcasts. This is only the second time I've been interviewed since this book came out last September. And that's my fault. That's because I'm an introvert and I'm scared of doing this shit. Until once I get going, and then I can't stop. But so I need help. And if anyone is so motivated to even consider being on a team, a small group of people that meets virtually at whatever level of intervals we decide works, 4 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 months, I'm not sure, but to feed me ideas and keep me accountable and say, Michael, your message is too important to keep it to yourself because of your own self-centered fears. Get your butt moving and we'll help you with this maybe. So again, use that email that I think you'll see on the screen a little bit later to contact me if you're willing to even consider doing that, and we can talk about it.
Michael, can you tell us that email? Because some people might be just listening rather than watching.
Oh, sure. Yeah. It's michael@michaelgoldstein.us. And I'm going to spell that because people have questions both about Michael and Goldstein. It's MICHAEL at, and then Michael Goldstein, one word. And Goldstein is GOLDSTEIN. And then there are a million Michael Goldsteins out there. .com.org were taken long ago. It's if you want to get me, it's .us.
.us.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks, Debbie.
Wow. Well, now you've left me speechless. I thank you so much for your time today, and I would encourage people to contact Michael, encourage people to interview Michael because you do a great job, and he'll hold you accountable, and I'll see what I can do to get you some interviews as well.
That would be great. Can I add one thing?
Yeah. Final words?
Well, not final words, just the last thing on my list of what you might do. Share this podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this was Michael Goldstein, and I think it would be a privilege for anyone to have the opportunity to have spoken with an attorney, a graduate of Yale, a graduate of Stanford.
Princeton.
I felt
Princeton.
Princeton? Oh, I'm so sorry. That was a terrible mistake.
Terrible.
Oh, dear. Sorry, a graduate of Princeton, a graduate of Stanford, a longtime participant and thinker and attorney. And I feel honored, Michael, that you were willing to come speak on my podcast, and I can't imagine that others wouldn't want that opportunity to learn from you and learn with you. And so encourage folks to absolutely share this podcast and um, go to Corruption Chronicles. You'll find it on YouTube, you'll find it on Spotify, Google, Amazon, and also purchase The Happiest Corruption: Sleaze, Lies, and Suicide in a California Beach Town. And I suspect that if you go to my website, debbiepeterson.com, and that's DebbiePeterson.com, you'll also find the connections that you need to other blogs and also to the online course, Double Dias Adventures in Local Government. So thank you everyone for listening, and have some fun looking at all of this and figuring it out, and discover what a joy it is to meet other people who share your commitment to making change. Thanks again, Michael.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for having me and for everything you're doing.
Thanks.